get started. Great. Well, we might get started on this panel. I'm going to introduce you to this great collection of experts in just a moment. But first, I want to say a word about you. You are the survivors. You are people of stamina. You're here on the almost the last panel on the last day. So congratulations for that. Let's see if this is moving. I wonder if we can get the next slide. We tried this 2 minutes ago, so we're sure it does work. But I think it's a bit frozen. We might just see if we can get some help to move to the... Yeah. Okay, great. Here we go. So we have a great collection of people up here, and the format we're going to undertake is I've been asked to give a couple of minutes of kind of scene setting, and then we have a couple of rounds of questions for our experts up here, which we'll take in turn, and I'll introduce you to each speaker in turn. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. And it's a relatively small group, so we should really I hope we have a kind of open discussion on that and involve you in this discussion as well. So just to start off, here we are. There we go. It turns out I can't work slides. We're going to talk about a couple of things here, as you'll see in the program. Firstly, how online platforms help create economic value and how they can advance the cause of sustainable development. We're going to talk a bit about emerging issues relating to the role of platforms and intermediaries more broadly in sustainable development. And finally, of course, we're going to get into the meat of what are the policies necessary for intermediaries and platforms and the best opportunities for SMEs to thrive globally. So a quick introductory look. I think we've had 3 days of fairly lengthy discussions about the link between the internet and development. So I just want to have a very quick framing up here. This is from the World Bank, from their digital dividends report that they did last year, and they identified 3 key areas where the internet helps with development. Inclusion, that's to say bringing people into the fold, health, remote delivery of education, access to markets. They talked about efficiency, that's to say efficiency of information, being able to find information directly without needing to go through gatekeepers. Communication, efficiency in communication, and we all know how much cheaper communication is it is today than it was 20 years ago. And finally, innovation, the ability to deliver innovative new services, for example, to bank the unbanked. So to my mind, when we talk about the benefits of the platform economy, it's not a story about platforms. Platforms are there. They create income. They create jobs. There are platforms of varying sizes, very big ones that are well-known global multinationals. There are very small ones that are local to countries. They, of course, are a big part of this economic opportunity. They create income. They create jobs. But really, I don't think the story here is about them. I think the story is especially about the people who use those platforms and the economic value that is created by the users of those platforms. That's a very important, I think, distinction that we should think through the 2 different types of benefit that accrue from within the platform economy. And actually, when you think about the size of the benefit to those who use the platforms, that dwarfs the benefit that accrues more broadly in the platform economy. They both are important. It's important to have platforms in societies that are playing a role in their economic development in their own right. But the size of that benefit is actually not the one we should be focused on. The one we should really focus on, to my mind, are the users. So I pulled up a couple of statistics here. And one thing that's interesting is there is very little data out there about the benefit of platforms to users, right, to the individual citizens, to SMEs. There is a bit of a data gap. But I did pull a couple of numbers that are Google-specific, which looked at what is the consumer value generated by Google products in Indonesia. And we engaged a third-party consultant to look at that, an economic research agency called Alpha Beta. And they suggested that in Indonesia, the consumer surplus, the benefits that consumers get from using those products is worth 12.9 billion. And there are additional savings as well, right, in terms of hours saved in traffic and so on. And in India, we looked at the Indian Language Internet Alliance, for example, which has the potential to connect 440 million English or Hindi-speaking people to the internet, and that would add around $46 billion to GDP. So the size of the pie is very considerable when you look at consumer surplus, when you look at the economic value created by using platforms. That's especially the case for SMEs, and I think we're going to dwell a little bit on that in this panel. If you look, for example, in Australia, small businesses that are online are twice as likely to be actually growing, is a mistake there, so twice as likely to be growing, 4 times as likely to be hiring staff. And in Asia Pacific, some recent research that's come out through the newly launched APAC MSME Trade Coalition suggests that using digital tools can generate up to an 82% reduction in the cost of exporting for small business. In other words, it's a transformative impact for a small business to take part in the platform economy. And some other work done by Oxford Economics looked at if we double the number of websites in Asia Pacific for small businesses, the number of small businesses with a website, it'd create 35 million new jobs and $1.5 trillion in new export sales. So this is all sort of summing up to say, look, the size of the opportunity here on the user side is very significant. In closing, 3 key areas where I think that plays a role. The first is with platforms allow local SMEs access to global markets. They allow them to reach consumers in other countries at zero or close to zero cost, at marginal cost, to reach consumers in markets all around the world from their own country. And they can actually set up an export business without having to get on an aeroplane. That's a huge new market. The second piece is around technology, and I touched on that just a second ago. If you think about either a citizen or an SME in a developing country, they have access to exactly the same technology as the wealthiest Wall Street banker. The email they use will be exactly the same email as the wealthiest, most powerful banker in the world. So I think that's an important point as well about the equalizing nature of technology. Available that the platforms typically are highly sophisticated technological tools that are simply not possible for an SME to develop organically. And finally, there's a trust piece here, which to my mind actually works in a bit of a proxy for a brand. And as SMEs grow, a lot of their efforts focus on brand building and becoming known and aware. And in some ways, actually, the need for that is being replaced to some extent by reviews. And I know when I travel now, I'll look for a local car, to take me around in a particular location I'm going to. I'll look for local hotel, restaurant reviews, and so on. I use those reviews almost as a proxy for brand. So to me, those are the 3 kind of core areas where platforms are providing a degree of benefit to SMEs. But before we go into the panel, I want to show you just a very quick video. It's 3 minutes long, and it's from actually, from an SME owner talking a little bit about why this is important. And to me, I like this because it helps demonstrate and reinforce to us as we have, fairly arcane discussions, that are happening around the corner around, a moratorium on customs duties. These are all very important, but let's remind ourselves of why we're doing this. So I'm going to see if this video works.
After I graduated, I worked in the US for 1 year. When I came back to Thailand, I couldn't find the things that I used to wear in Western countries. I always loved fashion, and I see the opportunity to make this as a business. So I talked with a couple of friends about the design, and then I went to pick up the fabric. Chinatown is a very unique place. There are so many fabric shops. The key thing is you have to know what to buy and where. At the beginning, I make catalogs. I couldn't track the customers that come to my website and buy my product. Later, I used social media to market my business. I started running online advertising. After I went online, I see that my sales increase. Also, more visitors come to my website. You can even know which marketing platform that bring the customer to your website and eventually buy the product. Having online is a huge cost saving. It was very excited when I got my first sale from the US. If I didn't have the website and social media, running the business would be very, very difficult. In the future, I'm very excited about exploring other online platform channels to sell my products.
Great. So with that, I'd just like to pass to John and introduce you to John Karr, who's the Senior Director for Technology Programs at the Asia Foundation. His current focus is the role of online platforms in international development, the future of work, and distributed systems and blockchain technologies in the Asia Pacific. So we're very lucky to have him here from San Francisco today. So John, first question, perhaps we could hear a bit from you from a development perspective and understand more about where you see the opportunity here. What sort of role can platforms play in overcoming traditional development challenges?
Sure. Well, I think it's a little bit more than just a trade issue. Platforms play a kind of mediating role, a connecting role, and that's really interesting, and the technology allows that mediation to be very kind of sophisticated. So I think you can kind of solve complex problems between groups, and you can also scale up at a really low marginal cost or almost zero. And so as I was sort of saying, it's a little bit more than trade, because countries that are low income or middle income, they need to progress beyond that state. And so a lot more needs to happen than just pure economics. You have to focus on institutions and grow a capacity to educate a population, to provide health care, make sure that the population has financial services, access to banking institutions. And also, I kind of call these things sort of micro opportunities, where maybe it's a job board or some way to connect to an employment opportunity, or even just small tools for micro entrepreneurs who are maybe just starting a business, and they can access more powerful services online, and some of them provided by Google, for example, for free. And the economics behind platforms makes that kind of subsidization of a user base possible. So it's a very interesting and intriguing area for the Asia Foundation, and one that we work in and explore. So, I think there are a lot of really exciting things happening in Asia. A lot of platform entrepreneurs and new experiments happening. One example is a education platform in India called Byju, and this is very niche and very specific for the country context, and is delivering education content to sort of like 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, and it's very sophisticated, high-quality content, and they're using a kind of machine learning algorithm to deliver custom content to each user. So you've got 800,000 students, many of whom are paying. This is a profitable company, to get access to high-quality education content that actually evolves with them and is responsive to their inputs and their engagement. So that's kind of what I mean by a sophisticated mediation between different parties. So there's educators delivering content to students, and it's more of a machine-based process that is evolutionary when it comes to the users interacting with the platform. And it's a really exciting project. Their vision is to take education in India beyond just exam preparation, and really teach people how to think and learn. And so I think Byju is a great example of a platform that focuses on education. There's also, if you know the region and anywhere in the developing world, there are other problem areas. Healthcare is one. In Asia, there are many, many, many private independent pharmacies, and they're run by mom and pop companies or individuals, and they're oftentimes not very skilled at delivering services. They also stock materials that don't have a very long shelf life, but in the heat, it degrades very quickly, and they're oftentimes also prescribing medication improperly. So there's this problem. The problem is what to do about this kind of natural phenomenon of pharmacies springing up all over the region selling materials to consumers, but not having a technical knowledge or the capacity to manage their stock and the value chain of medicine. So there's a platform in the Philippines called M-Clinica. And M-Clinica has done something really interesting. They've connected pharmacists, customers, and drug companies in a really interesting way so that they're able to subsidize purchases by individuals, keeps them coming back, gets them logging onto the platform, and also incentivizes the pharmacists to join this platform. Now, they've managed to connect over 10,000 independent pharmacies in the Philippines on this platform. Probably more than half of the pharmacies, the independent pharmacies in the entire country, and this is a very large island nation. And what they're doing is they're able to monitor the stock of medicine and the value chain there and make sure that they're delivering messages to consumers about what to look out for, and also to the pharmacies about how to manage their stock, and also reminders to take your medicine. And why is that important? It's because improper prescriptions, antimicrobial medications that are underpowered or taken at a volume that's below the normal prescription level can contribute to real problems of diseases that are resistant to medication. And this is actually a major health problem in the developing world. So I know I just have a short time to do this, so I'm just going to raise those two as really great examples, and I can talk more about others as we go forward.
Thanks, John. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you. Next, let me please introduce Heidi Beitler, who is a trade and integration senior specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank, where he leads technology-based projects in trade facilitation. And many of you may be familiar with Connect Americas, which Heidi leads, and the Argentine Trade Single Window. And Heidi also coordinates the Americas Business Dialogue's Digital Economy Working Group, and is co-founder and CEO of Nihilist.org, which is a non-profit technology organization. So thanks very much for joining us, Heidi. And you have a lot of, I guess, real-world practical experience in making things work for SMEs, in Connect Americas and elsewhere. So could you maybe talk us through a little bit about how SMEs can use them to scale up their business and internationalize?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I, at the Inter-American Development Bank, we launched this platform, ConnectAmericas.com, where we have almost 2 million now users from Latin America and the Caribbean. They are all small businesses, and in many cases, they are also entrepreneurs, students who want to go into the business world. And one of the things we learned is that when you provide a platform for people to engage professionally, you're not only you're clearly facilitating a transaction between someone who has something to offer and someone who has something to consume, and just like any content piece anywhere. But we've also noticed that you're also encouraging people to see what it is about. So the idea of an entrepreneurial culture as something that's fundamental in the business community and in the growth of the private sector is something that in Connect Americas we saw it. We saw, for example, we launched on top of, this is a B2B marketplace for imports and exports. But on top of that, we launched content, tons of content, webinars, online open courses, tutored courses, even forums, physical forums where people would gather and have a chance to speak with consultants, business consultants. And many of them, actually almost 30% of them, were people who weren't actually selling or buying anything. They were just interested in understanding how the technology could help them in case they ever wanted to become entrepreneurs. And so that, just think about that, the perception of the world being easier for you now to start a business is in and of itself a value that you want to encourage. Connect Americas is a platform that has over $4 billion in business deals. And we can't say how much would have not happened if it weren't because of Connect Americas, because that simple arithmetic is actually the opposite of simple. It's very complicated to calculate, but we do have some reasonable proxies about what would they do, and Kati may speak about this later, but we ran a survey of hundreds of companies in Latin America asking them, what would you do now, or what would be the consequence if we took this away from you, if you didn't have this sales channel anymore? And the average response was a loss in productivity up to 50%. They would lose 50% of their business if they couldn't engage online anymore. It's become not only a platform that facilitates business, but also a platform that attracts new people into the idea of starting a business now that the entry barriers are lower, and also a platform that people, they perceive they must have. And so today's someone from Mercado Libre, Jacobo Cohen, was actually quoting Jack Ma saying that the regulation of e-commerce is not about e-commerce, it's about all the rest. And I think there's an incredible point there, in the sense that people are there already. So now we have to move on to the next stage of conversations that we need to have in order to facilitate all these transactions. Now that you've met a client, now that you created successful content, I don't know, on YouTube, what do we do next with you? And I think that's the next generation of the debate that we're engaging in, is the one that I think is going to get exciting in the next few years.
That's great, and maybe we can pick up a bit of that in the Q&A. Yeah. That's great, thank you. Yeah. Next, please let me introduce you to Probir Mehta, who's the global lead for intellectual property and trade policy at Facebook. And prior to this, he was assistant USTR for intellectual property and innovation in the Office of the US Trade Representative. So thanks very much for joining us, Probir. Facebook, reaches billions of people around the world. What's the best way, from your perspective, to help local populations make the most of platforms such as Facebook to grow and take advantage of the opportunity?
Thanks so much, Andrew, and really great to be on this distinguished panel. And thanks very much to the organizers, the ICTSD, and the companies that have sponsored this. So I'll approach this question from a platform perspective and dig a little bit deeper into the nature of what Facebook does, some of the other apps and services that are in the Facebook family, such as Messenger and WhatsApp. But really, it's hard to discuss the impact in a better way than we just saw in the video. And frankly, that's sort of, you saw the young entrepreneur crediting social media, of course Facebook is a social media platform, with helping her reach customers outside of her normal channels, helping her to reach customers in the United States. And if you take a step back, it's an extraordinarily impressive thing that, just 15, 20 years ago, you had a very different situation. And with the rise of broadband access, with the rise of kind of the mobile revolution and the costs of mobile phones going down, you've really seen online platforms become, what I would call a force multiplier for promoting sustainable development. And I can speak from the Facebook perspective and a little bit about what some of the benefits of social media are for driving economic activity, especially in the developing world. So Facebook, of course, the mission of Facebook is to bring the world closer together and to build community. And ultimately, that's been an animating force for the development of Facebook and in countries around the world, connecting families, connecting friends, enabling families and friends to share photos, information, updates. But it's far more than, I think, as we've talked before, than sort of cat photos or photos of family. There's a lot more that the technology can enable, and especially in the developing world. So Facebook transitioned about 4 or 5 years ago to really having a strong, active presence on mobile. And that change, I think, is really remarkable because, I'd say significant amounts of the developing world access the internet not through a desktop computer sitting in their home, but rather through mobile devices. And that is an extraordinarily important fact to understand why Facebook can be a force multiplier. So Facebook has created an online, mobile-ready interface that loads quicker, that can allow the many people and increasingly small and medium enterprises, or SMBs, to trade, to do business, to reach customers. And it's often in areas with low internet penetration can be the only way to do that. So for example, many of you are probably users of Facebook. For those that are not, Facebook ultimately is a platform to connect people. And apart from individuals having accounts, you can sign up for a free Facebook page. And that can be your home on the Facebook social network. And that's an opportunity to have an opportunity to reach people, to talk about your services. For example, if you want to talk about the leather wallets that you manufacture in Argentina, if you want to talk about other products or services or content that you're creating, it's a powerful way. And that's how people can reach these types of businesses. And so obviously, there are advertising, people-to-people marketing that's also enabled by Facebook. But what we found is actually through a number of studies that the pages aspect is really key. And I'd note that there are 70 million SMBs around the world that use Facebook pages and really have driven some pretty interesting results. So just if you'll allow me, Andrew, I'll just, for Argentina, and this is something that we released this week, in partnership with Morning Consult, which is a consultancy firm, we studied the impact of SMBs, Facebook on SMBs in Argentina and other countries around the world. There's a dashboard that we've released on our website, and found some interesting statistics. And really, this is something that we'll be pursuing, more greater in the coming months and years. But so, for example, of the SMBs on Facebook, 1 in 4 built their business and credit Facebook for helping to grow their business. 4 in 10 SMBs on Facebook, again, this is in Argentina, credit Facebook with growing their business to the point that they hired more people, creating more jobs. And I think what is really interesting for the discussion that we're having here, 70% of SMBs on Facebook said it helps them trade with new markets, whether it's outside their city, their state, their province, their region, and the rest of the world. So it's really important to kind of see the impact. Again, this is just in Argentina. And I'm sure that if you look across the world, there are similar levels of impact. So just, again, this is just from the Facebook perspective. We not only have Facebook pages, but then we also have WhatsApp, which is an incredibly powerful communication tool that people also use to drive economic opportunity, especially in Asia. And I definitely agree with Andrew that there's so much going on there. And, of course, Facebook Messenger, which is now a new way for businesses to reach customers, and in fact is developing artificial intelligence tools to help interface with businesses. You can ask a messenger bot questions that the business can pre-populate. What's your address? What are your hours? Other related business tools. And it's really important, again, to have that 24/7 access to businesses. So I think this is just scratching the surface, but I definitely want to talk a little bit further about how our platform can create a very strong impact, I think, which is the first part of our discussion today.
Thank you. Next up, I'm delighted. We're very lucky to have Kati Suominen here joining us on the panel. We're speaking about creating businesses, and Kati has actually created many of those herself. She's founder and CEO of Next Trade Group, a data and research company, founder of Trade Up Capital Fund, founder of Business for E-Trade Development, and lead coordinator and co-founder of the new Singapore-based Digital Standards for Trade. Kati is adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and adjunct professor at UCLA Anderson School of Management. And she's written a lot of books. I have a long list here, but which is great. And I think we'll come on to that actually very specifically, because I think it's very relevant, actually one in particular to this. You've written a book about making trade great again, about the benefit, how the benefits of disruptive technology can be accessed by all. So perhaps you care to just talk us through a bit about some of those ideas.
Great, thank you so much, and great to be in a great panel. Actually, yeah, this book has been in the making for the past 4 years, and it's still in the making, so I hope to get it out in the next couple of months. It's coming out with Stanford University Press. And the genesis, actually the origin of this book came while I was working with Adi and IDB on a book report on how SMEs in Latin America were engaging in exports. This was back in 2013. And what we found in that exploration was that only 13% of companies in Latin America exported, 6% in countries like Brazil or Mexico that are had larger domestic markets. And of course, then we were asking ourselves, well, how do we change this? How do we enable more companies in Latin America to export? And this was a time when eBay started to come up with studies about how e-commerce and eBay is enabling companies to export. In the United States, for example, traditionally 3% of companies have exported. On eBay, 96% of companies that were on eBay exported. And I was looking at these data, and I was absolutely stunned. I thought, Eureka, we have found the silver bullet for companies to internationalize. Finally, here it is. All of us who have been working on trade and helping SMEs globalize, e-commerce is it. And then I was able to talk to the eBay crew and look at the data and so forth, and was very impressed how solid it was. So that kind of led me to this book to think about the impact of technologies on international trade, and it's a much broader exploration. I go into looking at how 3D printing is disrupting global supply chains, how Internet of Things is lowering the cost of global shipping, how the smartphone revolution that probably you were mentioning is basically globalizing globalization, bringing the global shopping mall to every palm around the planet, enabled by a lot of the connectivity that Facebook is creating out there. But this has also led me to a lot of kind of empirical work on e-commerce, and then helping kind of catalyze and build some of these global initiatives around e-commerce, like E-Trade for All and a new public-private partnership alliance for E-Trade development that is very much focused on platform, catalyzing kind of platform-enabled trade. So I've been very compelled personally by this opportunity, and I'll give you a couple of numbers to respond to Andrew's call for data on the impact of platforms. I had a chance to work with USAID support in running business surveys in different developing countries with SMEs as well as large companies, seeking to understand how much they participate in e-commerce and then what are the impacts of that for their internationalization, to have some more systematic data and data that is not necessarily only coming from the industry, to also look at companies that are not necessarily on platforms like eBay. And I'll give you a couple of headline kind of statistics. When we're looking at companies that are kind of offline sellers, or then companies that buy online, sell online, and buy and sell online, it's a huge difference and a very systematic difference in every single country. What I find is that offline sellers, typically 20% of them export, of small businesses, below 50 employees, whereas of the online sellers, 60% export. Of the larger companies, 30% of offline sellers export, 90% of online sellers export. The online sellers are also much more diversified in their export. So of the offline sellers that export, 70% of them export to just one market, 30% to 2 or more markets. Of the online sellers, the numbers are the reverse. 30% sell to one market, 70% sell to 2 or more markets. So e-commerce is really enabling these companies to diversify their exports, which gives them a lot of cushion. If one market goes bad or one customer in one market, they have options in other markets. I also find that companies that are online sellers grow faster. Typically, 45% of them grow at 10% or more of the offline sellers, probably a third of them grow at those rates. And it appears that the online sellers also are more integrated in global value chains, or rather have built their own global value chains. They tend to be both exporters and importers, whereas the offline sellers tend to just do either, typically buy something online, which is very much the case in Latin America. There's a lot of companies that buy something online, import that way, but don't export that much online. So they're not necessarily two-way traders. And to Adi's point, we did also wonderful work with Connect Americas, surveying Latin American companies with a somewhat different methodology. And one of the highlights that stood out for me is that for companies that had gone on internet and started to sell online, 2/3 of those had scored new customers as well in foreign markets. So it wasn't only a tool for them to sell to their customers that they already had, but also to diversify their customer base in different markets. Of course, then you look at the numbers that eBay has produced since 2013. They have produced wonderful reports on this, and their numbers are even more striking. And why is that? That's because they survey or they look at eBay sellers that happen to be on a giant global platform where there are 200 million buyers by now on that platform. So of course, these trends are even accentuated, but these data speak to that, I was able to speak to all companies that are out there. They may have their own online store and so forth, and it really gives us a basis to say that this is a great opportunity for companies around the world. I would also want to just highlight something that in these explorations and presentations that I've had in different countries to illustrate some of the points that Probir was making. I went to present in Bangladesh, and they said 90% of Bangladeshi online sellers are actually Facebook sellers, that they don't sell necessarily on online platforms for whatever reason, or they don't have their own online stores yet, typically because of payments challenges. But they are on Facebook, and they are marketing their products, and they are kind of then taking the transaction offline, and they are just about all of them are on Facebook. We ran a study with the Asian Development Bank on Pacific Islands and women in e-commerce there. And the same story. They were all on Facebook selling to customers to New Zealand or Australia. So it seems like Facebook is a wonderful training ground, if you will, a boot camp for companies that want to get into e-commerce. And recently I heard a story, and I'll conclude with this, about a lady in Cambodia who is doing the same on Instagram. And she's putting all these pictures online, and people love her products. And then she's selling, has figured out the distribution. So she uses buses that go to rural areas, take the parcels. And where does she get the product? From Alibaba. So she consolidates from Alibaba the products, brings them to Cambodia, gets a discount on the shipping, what have you, and then is basically a distribution. So distributor for Alibaba, essentially. It's a wonderful model of entrepreneurship that would not be possible without there being two platforms, Alibaba and Instagram, in this case. And I completely echo the issue about smartphones. That's the other side of this equation. As in, I think the numbers are something like 6 billion people by 2020 will have a smartphone. And particularly people that make $10 to $60 a day, kind of the global bulk bracket will come online, and that opens tremendous opportunities for anybody to sell anything to anybody, anywhere, basically. So I think it's a great opportunity, and my worry is, and we can probably deepen on that, is that we have this unstoppable force of technology, and then we have an immovable object in policy and these antiquated legacy systems like customs regulations and so forth that obstruct the benefits from this technology revolution.
Thank you, Katie, that's very insightful. Thank you for the data as well. And I think it's a great segue, actually, to come on now to talk a bit about some of the policy pieces. So we have now our second and final round of questions. And I want to make sure that people in the audience have a chance to ask questions. So I'll just keep, if I could ask panelists maybe to keep your response to this question to sort of 2 or 3 minutes, that would be ideal. Thank you. Yeah. But first to John, and actually it's interesting, we've just talked, I think, just then about Facebook, we've talked about Google, Alibaba, Instagram. These are all kind of big platforms. But, and I think when people think about platforms, they often tend to think about the bigger international platforms. So John, I'd like to ask you a question, because you mentioned also a small Indian platform. What does the platform landscape look like? Are there these smaller platforms out there? How important is it for a country to have its own platforms as opposed to people taking advantage of international platforms? And what does that landscape look like from your perspective?
Sure. Well, again, I come from Asia. I focus on Asia, and I basically work with Asian developers and entrepreneurs and think about these issues of, opportunity for innovation and creation. And I think there are certainly big players and there are established players, and competition is very intense. But it's now, as people have mentioned on the panel now, so easy to start businesses that are online that might provide some kind of a service or some kind of a platform-based interaction, that it really comes down to knowing your customer and knowing your local context really, really well, and you can still win. I think there are a lot, there's too many to list, and numbers of examples of winners in the Asia-Pacific region. Just go back to the education story. There's a real interest across the region, and I think everywhere in the world, to connect students with tutors outside of the formal education process to just, sharpen skills and hope that your kids can pass the exams and go on to higher education. So you would think that maybe if we're making this assumption about established platforms kind of dominating, there's a platform in the United States called Chegg, which is an IPO, $250, $300 million education startup that does match or tries to match tutors and advisors with students. You would think maybe that generalizable case would be applicable all over the world, but I think if you go and look at Asia, you can see examples of very, very successful platforms that are doing that in country contexts. Like in China, there's a platform called Yuan Fudun, which is valued now, I think, at over $1 billion, and is reaching tens of millions of people. There's a similar platform in Indonesia called Ruang Duang, I think, and it's the same thing, and also successful, profitable. So I think it's knowing the country context and knowing the customer gives the advantage still. You can look at Uber as a great example, and if you go to Asia, you find in Indonesia there's an Uber competitor that won in Indonesia called Gojek. These stories are numerous, and it's the same in the United States, where incumbent actors who had very well-established businesses like PayPal come along. Here comes Stripe, which is sort of a really, really, really successful company that kind of took PayPal's business in many respects. So there's all manner of reasons why opportunity is here, and I think the danger is overlooking that and policies that overlook this opportunity. Policies that might shut it down because people are afraid of incumbent actors like Google or Facebook. They're taking over the world. That's not, there are winners at that scale, but there's also a lot of competition. And if you go and you look in the region, at least where I work in Asia Pacific, you see lots of winners at a very high level of scale that are very profitable. So I think policymakers need to think about that, because regulations shouldn't close out opportunity for the local developer community and the innovators and the entrepreneurs, the people who want to build solutions that are local, that know their customers better than American companies. So, I mean, that's...
Thanks a lot. That's great. Heidi, it's that time of year when people start thinking about the future, you know, next year, what it's going to look like, a bit of future gazing. So maybe you could give us a bit of a sense from your perspective of what does the future hold for platforms and SMEs in Latin America, and how important is the regulatory landscape in shaping that?
So, yeah, I think, first of all, that, if anyone hasn't read it yet, that's a great book to read. It's called The Third Way by Steve Case, founder of America Online, and I think he's right, and particularly in Latin America. We are moving from, like he calls the second generation platforms, which I think YouTube is, Facebook is, Instagram is, which is platforms that exchange digital content. And now we're moving into platforms that facilitate physical exchange of goods and services that are getting into more heavily already regulated industries. And that includes education, transportation, health. And I think we're moving there in Latin America very fast because we are the most unequal region in the world, and so the exploration for solutions that are suitable for socially, they have an area of coincidence with industries that are heavily regulated because of the same reason. They are protecting socially valuable assets like people's health and people's education. And so when we think about how we're going to tackle those problems, and forget about who's an incumbent and who's a newcomer, but about what you were saying at the beginning. In this case, the users are students and patients and people who we care about way beyond their digital interaction. And to me, there's been so many misconceptions among policymakers that come from this very necessary idea of understanding the difference between what's digital and what's not, and what exactly are you regulating that goes beyond the internet. So, for example, we at the NGO I run and created with friends, what we do is we rescue food that producers and restaurants are about to discard, which are edible, and we organize a fleet of drivers who pick it up and deliver it in shelters. And it's going great. We actually won awards for social impact in Argentina. And one of the first conversation we had to have was with the regulatory authorities in the cities that we were delivering to understand whether or not you could deliver food without a special permit that apparently you need to have. And that wasn't an internet policy discussion. That was simply, can you deliver food or can you not? But we were sent to the telecom regulators to discuss food delivery. So I guess our job in the most unequal region in the world now is to be very clear about what it means and what are the limits of the analogic and the digital discussion, if it makes sense.
That's great. Yeah, no, thank you. Probir, it seems, you know, on this panel at least, we're all quite kind of, we see a lot of the opportunity, I think it's fair to say, from the perspective of people taking advantage of platforms. But perhaps you could give a bit of a sense as well as what from a platform perspective, some of the challenges that are going to be important to overcome to realize that opportunity might be, and what role trade can play in that.
Well, I think that's a very good observation, that there are a number of challenges that platforms are not only facing now, but we can see that unfortunate there are trends for that. So first, I would start with ensuring the ability to sort of have cross-border data flows. I mean, that sort of seems like a very simple concept, but we really have risks if we can start having different balkanized regions where data sort of is kept in that area. And given that so many of these platforms, virtually all of them, have cloud capabilities that rely on servers located in different jurisdictions, you need to ensure that you can serve customers, especially in developing countries, from the most economically or the most sort of technologically appropriate place. And it doesn't have to be in that country, it could be in a neighboring country, but data now is moving across borders in such incredible ways in supporting not just platforms, but this is also back office operations, software programs that employees are using in companies around the world. Data needs to have that ability to move across borders. And I think that's where we're not only Facebook, and I know a number of other platforms are very worried about sort of recent developments with the data localization laws. And I think that's one area that we're tracking very closely. I think another area is ensuring on SMBs, if I could talk about that for a moment. We're seeing so many SMBs build audiences. I think Kati talked about some really interesting ways that they're, sort of serving in different aspects of the supply chain. It's really important to ensure that they have a minimum of burdens placed on their ability to trade. And I think that's where, digitizing customs rules, looking at trade rules through the eyes of an SMB. And what we're seeing is, there are interesting features where, for example, I'm sure folks who've been around all week heard about this, what's called a de minimis exception, which is a very favorite trade, sort of a wonky term, but it's an incredibly important concept where you should have the ability, if you're just shipping one or two products or small values, to be released from tariff obligations. Given that the vast majority of SMBs, if you look at, for example, the entrepreneur in Taiwan, clearly sending one or two products to different, often custom built, to different consumers. And we see some countries have extraordinarily low de minimis amounts, $20 in the case of one country. And that literally would kick all exports into a higher category. So it's really important. You don't need to be adding costs. You need to be sort of finding new ways to address that. So, and I would just say the last issue is just really looking at rules and trying to develop rules that allow online platforms, again, of all shapes, sizes, to do business and access other markets. We find this really important in the services construct. We find this important in balanced copyright rules, including enacting intermediary liability protections that virtually all platforms could benefit from. I know Argentina is looking at a law that way, so this is another area that governments can really set the ball. And so we worry about, again, trends going backwards. So those are just 3 or 4 examples, Andrew, and again, happy to talk about further ones.
Thank you very much. And Kati, finally, similar question for you. You shared some really quite amazing numbers, actually, I think, not just about the potential, but about the reality, actually, currently, of how SMEs are taking advantage of this opportunity. So perhaps you could also share some thoughts as to what you think is necessary to protect that and to advance the cause.
Great. Well, in this survey work that I was citing, we also asked about the challenges. So it kind of builds on the same sample of companies. And when you think about the enabling environment for platforms or for e-commerce, there's a number of elements, right? You have to have connectivity, you have to have online payments, logistics, good digital regulations, good business environment in general, access to finance and things like that. There's a whole enabling environment. But if you're a policymaker in an LDC, say, you can only do so much. So you have to prioritize. So the purpose here was to ask companies, the easiest way to figure out those priorities is to ask companies, what are your main challenges? What are the binding constraints in any one economy that need to be resolved? And what seems to the first observation that I got from that is that there is no one simple answer. It very much depends on what business segment you're looking at. If you're looking at micro enterprises in LDCs versus mid-sized companies in Latin America, in Brazil, you get very different answers as to what the priorities should be. So it depends on the public policy objective, what you're seeking to attain. But this survey allows you to do that. And what the three things that kept kind of coming up over and over were access to finance. Companies across the board, except for the larger ones, cited access to finance as one of the critical barriers for them to engage in e-commerce domestically or cross-border. And they seemed to be asking for digital finance solutions as well, which seems to indicate to me that the banking system is not necessarily responding to that segment, that we need more of the digital online lenders out there, like Mercado Pago has become in this region. Logistics is another area. Domestically, the challenge there is kind of cost of logistics, and of course, rural last mile delivery, which is much more expensive than urban last mile. In the cross-border context, again, it's the cost of the total cost of delivery to the consumer, and then customs regulations. I mean, customs is a huge problem, as was suggested here in the past, and I don't know exactly how to necessarily deal with that. De minimis would be the absolute silver bullet, and perhaps a negotiation, kind of plurilateral negotiation on de minimis, where it becomes an export agenda for everybody. Right now, it's an import agenda when you ask about raising your de minimis. Maybe we could turn that around by, I actually have a paper on that. And then, the third area that kept standing out from this survey that companies were complaining about or seemed to be a little bit worried about were digital regulations of all kinds, internet intermediary liability rules, copyright rules, data privacy rules, consumer protection laws, both domestically as well as cross-border. And I think that reflects some of these changes that are taking place with regulations, but it also may be already hitting some of these companies, some of these rules, and there's probably lack of knowledge as well as to what they mean. In the cross-border context, companies seem to be worried about, including small companies in countries like Philippines, worried about the interoperability of their country's digital regulations with those of the trading partners. Because you may have to apply a very different set of rules if you're exporting to another market or expanding your operations there. And this is a challenge clearly for smaller companies. So overall, when you look at SMEs in LDCs, online payments, connectivity, access to finance are the key issues. For larger companies in emerging markets, it tends to be more of regulatory issues, digital regulations, customs issues that vex them. But those are the general patterns there. So there are things there to fix. In the main, when you ask companies about these different issues and ask them to rank, how would you rank the functioning of issue X from 1 to 10 in your market? Typically, the average in developing countries is about 4 or 5 in LDCs, 5 or 6 in the more advanced developing countries, if you will, here in Latin America as well. So there's a lot to do there. These are not happy customers. The enabling environment needs to be better in these countries. And when you ask these companies, well, what would happen if the top 3 challenges that you cited were removed? What would happen for your exports? They estimate gains of 30% in their exports, 34% in their domestic sales, and 28% in employment as well. So these are not negligible. These are really worth attending to some of these challenges. So what do we then do about them? I think there we need a lot of new ideas, both in terms of how to leverage technology in customs, for instance, how we can use big data to make customs more familiar with the patterns of small business trade and this tsunami of parcels, as people have put it in this conference, coming in. And then I think we need more understanding of what has already been done, kind of best practices. And this is something that we're doing in this Alliance for E-Trade Development with a number of US companies and USAID. We're looking at the practices and policies, regulations in about 40 countries across kind of 40 issues under digital regulations, payment regulations, trade facilitation, SME, export promotion, and other areas, really to map out what is going on out there, what are governments doing in these areas already, and could we perhaps then draw some best practices out of that. It's a challenging task, but I think it's very worthwhile. This is something that I hear from countries all around the world as I have been presenting some of this work, is this road mapping and model frameworks and what are other countries doing, who should they emulate. I keep hearing this question, and hopefully we are able to give some answers to that.
Thank you so much, Katie. And now we're just going to move to audience Q&A. So you have some experts here from business, from policy, from academia, from the development community. They're all at your disposal. So please don't be shy. I can see one question. I was going to see if there's a second. We'll take them together, but maybe we'll first please go to the gentleman over here, and I think a microphone is on its way.
Thank you for the fascinating discussion. I think that I learned a lot. I think it's really, you know, we're having this discussion next door to the ministerial meeting of the WTO, which I think the purpose is really what we want to, as an industry, we want to really promote and push forward for the new consensus and maybe new rules or whatever, you know, that can facilitate the online business. And as you all demonstrated, it's such a big business. And also, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Henry Huiyao Wang. I'm from Center for China and Globalization in China, in Beijing, a think tank based in Beijing. I was at the World Internet Conference at Wuzhen about a week ago. I was chairing one section there, which we have represented from eBay, from JD, and from you know, NetEase, and all the big companies, the Xiaomi, for example. So one of the things I'm really want to ask the panelists is that since the digital economy is going to explosive growth, I mean, in China it's already counts about $3 trillion US dollar business, you know, of the GDP already. And so what can be, you know, for the future as an international platform or international new mechanisms to facilitate that? Because at the WTO, it's very slow, and there's not getting any, you know, we still probably haven't heard what's going to be coming out of that. But I think as an industry, how can we push that forward? So I was just wondering, you know, for example, Argentina is going to have the G20 next year. And at the G20, we have, you know, B20, T20, Y20. Why can't we have E20, e-commerce 20, or I20, Internet 20? I mean, for example, we're sitting a few big companies here, and also US, China, and other countries have a lot of large international internet companies, IT companies, and e-commerce companies. So maybe as an industry, could we get some consensus among ourselves and to promote the global, facilitate the global, you know, ease of this e-trade? Because right now, there's a 300 million middle class in China wants to purchase the you know, online product worldwide, but then when it goes to the customers, and those all kind of legal issues, logistic issues, delivery issues, there's no international standards. We're on the infrastructure for policy framework, we're you know, hugely behind of the development. So what are the, you know, I was wondering if the panelists on the stage can, you know, tackle those issues or give some ideas. And so how the industry can work with WTO, or maybe we have an EWTO that really promote this. Because if it's going with the WTO, we make, again, a very slow progress. But can we have a DWTO that we can really push forward the future business model? You know, the future business, you know, ecology that really going to generate the huge growth for the next 30, 40 years for the world. So I think that those big companies should really, you know, maybe concern on that, the policy front, and to work. I was just coming out of another trade facilitate platform. They are not really interested on doing the e-commerce. They're still talking about traditional trade. And there's another argument on that is that if the big companies that, like Google's, Alibaba's doing things like that, you're going to get rid of the small business. I mean, they're not, you know, the big platform will get rid of the, you know, other delivery business, other competitors. So there's argument on that. I heard from the other discussion this afternoon. So I wonder, you know, as the big leading companies, there's 10 largest internet companies in the world. I mean, maybe 20 of them. Could they, you know, really unite to do something? Have an I-20 together, really push forward some policy issues like that. So that's my question.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And there's a few moves underfoot, I think, on the within governments in terms of some of the countries that are pulling together in the D5 and elsewhere. But we can explore that a bit. Who would like to take that question?
Happy to provide.
Please do. Thanks, Probir.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the gentleman did talk about sort of platforms or large platforms and whether they could band together. I think clearly many of these platforms, of course, are also fierce competitors. So that's one thing to note, that, you know, there are a lot, and that's what I think is really interesting about this space, is that it's not that only one platform can succeed. You know, 1,000 flowers can bloom, and I think that's sort of some of the presentations talking about some of the platforms, local ones, especially in Asia, that have really risen and been able to serve their market based on cultural tastes, national issues. I think that's what I think is a very interesting perspective, and sure, there could be certain principles that are divined out of that, but I think that's where we should also look to international institutions. The World Economic Forum and others are doing really, really good work in this space. Of course, I would also have to mention the IDB, naturally, and of course, Asia Society. I mean, large and small, there's a lot of work, and maybe through that we can find common principles forward. But I think one of the things that I think we have to also be concerned about is just, this is taking an awful lot of time, and the risks to the online platforms are real, and ones that I think we need to address through, you know, whatever method is most effective. And I think that's where I think many would probably argue, if the WTO could work, and this today's announcement is a harbinger of good things to come, well, I think that's great. I think ultimately we have to pursue whatever option can get us over the line, and that may be regional agreements, they may be, you know, non-binding accords. I mean, I think that we shouldn't sort of put all our eggs in one basket. We should, again, look to a multiplicity of efforts.
Any other, I can see a couple of questions, or 3 questions we'll go to in a moment. So in fact, we might, just to make sure we get time, go straight to those unless anyone wants to jump in. And in fact, we might take 2 at the front, and then we'll move on. So please take these. Thanks. Debbie.
Yeah, Debbie Elms from the Asian Trade Center in Singapore. One of the things that you didn't mention in the policy challenges to come that I thought was striking is the quest for revenue. And I suspect that one of the challenges, especially for platforms in the future, is government seeking revenue, and they're going to come after platforms to get that revenue. So if I were a platform and I were thinking about my future, one of the things that I would be deeply alarmed about is, where is that revenue going to come from? Especially if you had a de minimis that came through, which I think would be fantastic for SMEs. Governments will say, where am I going to get that missing revenue from? And they're going to target especially the big platforms who are sitting on the panel. So I would say, in my future-looking problem list, revenue and taxation in particular against e-commerce is coming. So I would put that in my list of things to worry about.
Thank you. We'll just take another perspective here. And then
Thank you. I think I'm going to join that opinion. I'm Pınar Erten with Istanbul Big University, Faculty of Law, and I'm a WTO shareholder. Don't please, misunderstand me. I love those, all of the platforms that you are serving, and I, often use it. But as a lawyer, and mainly a competition lawyer next to trade lawyer, I see the competition element. Now, we all know that there are serious investigations, undertaken by the European Commission, DG Competition, against Amazon, against Google, against Apple, against the other platforms. And this is a serious component as well. Yes, you're becoming very big, but I think at some stage it's giant. How do you think of dealing with the antitrust issues, knowing that the other platforms, small platforms in several countries may not really cope up with the competition? So what are the alternatives which can be given for sustainable development? Are you going to go just big, or can we provide some more antitrust antitrust, even though competition is not within the WTO, unfortunately, as much as some would like to have. So I would like to have your opinions on how you look at the antitrust issues.
Okay, thank you. And I might just take the third question and we can group them together and then panelists can answer, which I think was over here.
So my question is very different than where we're all going here on finance. I think there's one thing, this is still sustainable development that we're talking about, and these platforms provide all these opportunities for shipping things all over the world. What nobody's providing is an issue of dealing with the carbon footprint of that kind of commerce, and that really scares me. Nobody's talking about consolidating shipments or putting things together. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I look in my apartment building garbage room every day, and I see more cartons, more plastic wrap, more bubble plastic all over the place. And each one of these products being individually wrapped and shipped is going to have a huge environmental impact. And somebody, some platform, and somebody better figure out how to address this before that becomes the next big issue. And I just don't think I've heard anything about that this week.
Thank you very much. So we have there three quite different topics, actually. And I'd just like to see who would like to pick up on one of those.
Well, I just say that unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember how fearful people were of Microsoft a number of years ago as a globally oriented multinational corporation that was going to take over the world and prevent competition. And perhaps for a moment that was the case, but some other things came along and surprised everyone. Unexpected things, mobile operating systems, Android, iOS. Also, I think the issue is we have to take a light touch, because what we're talking about now, I think, oftentimes is 5 or 6 people in a room building the next big platform that could provide real value to the world in ways that are unexpected. I think Patrick Collison and his brother started Stripe. I think it was 5, 6 years ago. Now it's a billion-dollar company powering web transactions at a global scale, saving every time and money, and doing things in a lot more efficient way than it used to be. And so there are these things that will happen. It's very hard to predict the future, and it's very hard to predict who will rise up and who will fall. But it's a dynamic process that I think is driven by entrepreneurship and by innovation and creativity. And a heavy-handed approach to regulation sometimes might run the risk of preventing that creative destruction. Because, again, we're just talking about a lifetime here of just a couple of decades. We've seen so much change, and we're going to see more going forward, because the bottom of the pyramid, and I'm working on a project now in Vietnam with the Vietnam Bank of Social Policy to connect low-income users with financial services on mobile. So microloans and microcredit, this is the bottom of the pyramid finally joining the digital payments world. This is 7 million users in Vietnam that are going to be able to participate in some way in opportunity. And so I think really it's finding the best and most practical regulatory framework that does what we need it to do, but also empowers innovators to kind of create and reinvent and remap in ways that we haven't anticipated.
Thanks very much. I want to take Gail's question on sustainability. Because of the experience I've been having in rescuing food, we throw away 40% of the food that we produce, and the carbon footprint of that is 3.3 gigatons per year. That would be the third most pollutant country in the world after China and the U.S. And what we found out is that the same rationale that platforms facilitate going across information asymmetries works for what they call the circular economy now. And so those same cartons that you see in your buildings could very well be reused for many, many purposes. And that market is created by regulations, by secondary markets of regulatory incentives for green technologies, or in my case, you get tax cuts and tax deductions if you donate the food instead of throwing it away. So that's a very important conversation to have. I agree with you, and but also keeping in mind that if we're ever going to solve that problem, if we ever had a chance to solve that problem, is now, because we have the technology available to connect people who are discarding stuff that can be reused. So all the more reasons to be hopeful that we're closer to a solution if the right incentives for companies to play by the rules are there, but also the right regulations to facilitate these secondary markets.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else like to add anything to the topics mentioned?
Just make a quick just comment to some of the questions. So I did focus the policy prescriptions on more trade-focused issues, and I think clearly the universe of issues that online platforms are facing are larger than that. So if you talk about tax, for example, there's not that many disciplines in the WTO. There are some, of course, but I just would note that I think that it's incumbent on platforms like Facebook and others to really also interface with governments and help them understand how they're operating and what they're doing, and also to be responsive to concerns. And that there's a recent newsroom post that you can see on our website about changing our some of our tax structures in countries around the world to a local buy-sell model. So that's something that was just released. I don't cover tax personally, but I know that's something that may be of interest.
We have tax policies coming in Asia, in Australia, in Singapore, in Thailand, in Indonesia, on goods and online services. So if you are buying and selling even through Facebook, you're going to be hit with taxes, local taxes, VAT, or GST, in markets in Asia. And they're going to be levied against the platforms, not against the companies themselves. So you, Facebook, I don't know how the hell they're going to do this, but you, Facebook, are actually going to have to collect the taxes on behalf of government for the sellers that are sitting on your platform. So all I'm saying is that as you think about this, we've always said tax is someone else's problem, it's not a trade issue, and all of a sudden, in an e-commerce world, this is suddenly becoming your trade problem as well.
I think, unless Probir wanted to add anything, we'll move on and take any final questions from the audience. Anyone got a question? One final question.
No, I just wondering, you know, like we have e-commerce now flourishing around the world, but then on when the goods of those e-commerce, when you order things online, for example, 300 million middle class wants to buy beef, or buy milk powder, or buy a cosmetic from different countries. When it goes through online on the customers, I mean, internationally there's no rate for that, and also regulations for that. So the WTO should talk about these e-com trade practices. That how can we go through the customers easily, or facilitating logistic delivery and all those things. So is there a platform talking about those things, about the trade, the tariffs for ordering online, going through different countries' customers? I mean, if that is open, then we really provide new impetus for the future global trade. So individually can be traders. I mean, you talk about your example from Thailand. You know, when they had orders from these 7 countries or whatever, how did it go through customers? Is it by postage, or is it by regular trade? What kind of tariffs are applied to those products? That things, we hope there's a platform to talk about that. Maybe have an EWTO to talk about that, and have a standard for that, so the goods of all the countries can flow everywhere.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I imagine they would be treated in a similar manner to an offline provision, but I don't know if anyone wanted to add any other perspectives on that. No? Oh, Katie, did you? No. Okay, great. Well, look, I think we're at the point in the day in which I think taxation and antitrust are competing with the restaurants and bars of Buenos Aires. So who am I to hold that back? So it just remains to say thank you very much to our panelists, providing their time and expertise to come and talk to us, and also to you, the audience, for your stamina. It's the last day of school, and you all get an A. So thank you very much.